Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. I hope you all are good. I welcome you all in another video lecture. And in this lecture, we are going to talk about anemia. Now, when we define anemia, it is actually a condition which is characterized by the low oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. So, anemia is actually a condition in which there is low oxygen carrying capacity of blood. We have already talked about red blood cells, and red blood cells may I have told you that the one of the most important function of red blood cells is actually the transport of oxygen, and that oxygen is transported in red blood cells in combination with hemoglobin, the hemoglobin which is present there inside the red blood cells. And that oxygen is actually responsible for the transport of this oxygen. This hemoglobin is responsible for the transport of oxygen. And so, if there is decreased oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, so there can be three things actually. One is if there is decreased red blood cell count, decreased RBC count. So if there is decreased RBC count, definitely the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood is going to decrease. The second thing is if there is decreased hemoglobin content in the red blood cells. Hemoglobin content. Because I've already told you that it is actually the hemoglobin in RBCs, in red blood cells, which is actually going to transport the oxygen. So if red blood cells are formed, but the hemoglobin is not formed enough, that means there is decreased hemoglobin content, and that is actually going to be called as anemia. And the third thing is if there is decreased packed cell volume. Packed cell volume, or we also call that as hematocrit. We've already talked about hematocrit, and hematocrit is actually the concentration of red blood cells in a given volume of blood expressed in percentage. And उसमें हमने देखा था कि जो normal PCV होता है, that is approximately 45%. And if that packed cell volume or that hematocrit is decreased, that should also be called as anemia. So anemia is a condition in which there is decreased oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, and that decreased oxygen carrying capacity of the blood can be because of decreased red blood cell count, because of decreased hemoglobin content, and because of decreased this packed cell volume. And when we talk about the causes actually of anemia are actually divided into three types. There can be three causes or three categories of causes जिनकी वजह से जो है ये anemia हो सकता है. The first thing is if there is decreased production of RBCs. If our body is not producing enough RBCs, so that means RBC count is going to decrease and our oxygen carrying capacity of blood is definitely going to decrease. So the first cause is if there is decreased production of RBCs. And the second cause is if there is enough RBCs produced in our body, but there is increased destruction of RBCs. Destruction of RBCs is increased. So RBCs are produced enough in the bone marrow, but there is increased destruction of RBCs. That also is going to decrease the RBC count, and that also is going to decrease the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. That is anemia. And the third cause is actually blood loss. The third cause is blood loss, or we call that as hemorrhage. So if we are losing blood from our body, so that blood loss, because of that blood loss, we will definitely lose red blood cells, and we will definitely lose some important things which are actually important for the formation of red blood cells. We will talk about that. So that is also going to cause the anemia, that is the decreased oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. Now, different authors have classified this anemia in different ways, but we are going to go with Mariab Anatomy and Physiology. That is the book I usually refer for all these lectures. And Mariab Anatomy and Physiology में जो classification of anemia दिया हुआ है, तो हम उसी के according जो है classification of anemia देखेंगे. और ये classification of anemia which we are going to talk about is actually etiological classification. Etiological classification means based on a particular cause, ये कौन सा type of anemia है, that is actually the etiological classification. I have already told you there are mainly three causes for anemia, and इन्हीं causes को अब हम देखेंगे जो है different types of anemia में. अब जो पहला type of anemia है which we are going to talk about is hemorrhagic anemia, and hemorrhagic anemia I have already told you is because of the blood loss from our body. And this hemorrhage can be of two types. One is the acute hemorrhage and second is the chronic hemorrhage. When we talk about acute hemorrhage, that acute hemorrhage actually means sudden, rapid loss of blood, and when we lose blood from our body in an increased amount. Right, we lose a lot of blood from our body, and that is because, for example, any road traffic accident, or for example after any stab wound I have mentioned here, तो इसकी वजह से there will be rapid loss of blood from our body, और जब हम इस blood के साथ जो है we are going to lose lot of red blood cells. And we are going to lose a lot of red blood cells. That means our red blood cell count जो है that will decrease in our body. That will lead to decreased oxygen carrying capacity in our body or in our blood. Then second is chronic this hemorrhagic anemia or chronic hemorrhage. This chronic hemorrhage means when we are losing blood, there is slight loss of blood, but this loss of blood is actually persistent loss. We are continuously losing blood for a longer period of time, but we are not losing एक ही साथ जो है हम blood को lose नहीं करते हैं from our body. हम धीरे धीरे जो है हमारा blood जो है हमारी body से जो है हमारे circulation से निकल जाता है, तो धीरे धीरे जो है ये blood हमारी body से निकल जाता है. We are losing this blood. There is slight loss of blood, but there is persistent loss of blood. For example, if there is any peptic ulcer disease, there is any ulcer in our जो है stomach, for example, or for example duodenal ulcer. अब उस ulcer की वजह से there will be continuous bleeding, but that bleeding जो है वो धीरे धीरे bleeding होगी, और उसकी वजह से जो है धीरे धीरे ये blood loss हो जाएगा, and that is called as chronic hemorrhage. तो उसकी वजह से भी we are going to lose red blood cells, but more importantly we are going to lose the nutrients which are actually very important for or minerals which are very important for the production of red blood cells. For example, in this chronic hemorrhage we are going to lose iron. And iron, we know, is actually very important for the formation of hemoglobin. So this chronic hemorrhage जो है इसकी वजह से जो anemia हो जाएगा, that is called as chronic hemorrhagic anemia. And it is actually, इसको हम treat करते हैं by treating the primary problem. For example, if there is this peptic ulcer disease, and this peptic ulcer disease को हमें treat करना है, we will treat the anemia. And अगर for example, another example is hemorrhoids. अगर hemorrhoids है तो उनको हमें treat करना है, तो हम जो है इस anemia को treat कर सकते हैं. लेकिन जो ये एक्यूट हेमोरेजिक एनीमिया है, जब हम एक साथ ही जो है ब्लड हमारी बॉडी से बाहर आता है, तो उसको हम ट्रीट करते हैं बाय रिप्लेसिंग द लॉस्ट ब्लड. हम जो है ब्लड ट्रांसफ्यूजन करते हैं, और जितना ब्लड हमने जो है हमारी बॉडी से बाहर आया होगा, हम उस ब्लड को रिप्लेस करते हैं. राइट. The second type of anemia we are going to talk about is iron deficiency anemia. Now, these four types we are going to talk about is actually decreased production of RBCs. Okay, in another video lecture we are going to talk about the types of anemia which will come under the destruction of RBCs. When there is increased destruction of RBCs, they are called as hemolytic anemia. अब आज जो है जो हम बात करेंगे, it is actually when there is decreased production of RBCs. Now, इनमें जो पहला type है, that is iron deficiency anemia. अब आयरन जो है, अभी मैंने आपको कहा हमारा हीमोग्लोबिन जो होता है, हीमोग्लोबिन इज एक्चुअली मेड अप ऑफ टू पार्ट्स. Hemoglobin, it is made up of heme part and it is made up of globin part. And globin is actually the protein part of hemoglobin, and heme jo hai, it is actually made up of two parts. One is iron and second is protoporphyrin. When protoporphyrin combines with the iron, it makes the heme part of hemoglobin. Now, for example, there is decreased iron available in our body, and that decreased iron which is available in our body, that is going to decrease the production of hemoglobin, because decreased iron, decreased heme. And if there is decreased heme production, there is definitely going to be decreased hemoglobin production. And if there is decreased hemoglobin production, what will happen is, and this actually is generally, जो मैंने अभी आपको कहा था, chronic हेमोरेजिक एनीमिया जो होता है उसमें हम एक्चुअली जो है ये आयरन जो है हमारी बॉडी से लूज करते हैं, तो जिसकी वजह से जो है आयरन डेफिशिएंसी एनीमिया होता है. सो आयरन डेफिशिएंसी एनीमिया जो है इट इज जनरली सेकेंडरी टू हेमोरेजिक एनीमिया. एंड second thing is it can also be there because of decreased intake of iron containing food. So iron containing food अगर हम ज्यादा जो है कंज्यूम नहीं करते हैं, so that means there is going to be decreased intake of iron in our body, and if there is decreased intake of iron in our body, so there is less iron going to be available in our body for the production of or for the synthesis of hemoglobin. Right. It can also be because of the decreased absorption of iron, because when we are taking the iron rich food, that is going to be that is going to go there in the gastrointestinal tract, and from gastrointestinal tract that is going to be absorbed into the blood. But if there is decreased absorption of iron from the gastrointestinal tract, that is very rare actually. Mainly it is because of the chronic hemorrhage, or it is because of the decreased intake of iron containing food. Right. इसके बाद इसमें जो RBCs प्रोड्यूस होंगे, now कॉमन सी बात है, if there is less hemoglobin synthesized in our जो है body, and that less hemoglobin is going to be available for the RBCs. अब RBCs जो इस एनीमिया में प्रोड्यूस होंगी, they will be जो है decreased in size. They are called as microcytes. और this anemia, this type of anemia जिसमें red blood cells जो है smaller size में जो है form की जाएंगी, that is called as microcytic anemia. Right. And apart from that, it will be hypochromic as well, because we already know that red blood cells are actually giving the red color to the, hemoglobin is actually giving the red color to the red blood cells. And if there is less hemoglobin present there in the red blood cells, that means red blood cells are not as red as that they should be. So they will not be normochromic, they will be hypochromic, because they will be less in color, they will actually appear kind of pale in color. So they are actually called as hypochromic, and they will be microcytic. Microcytic means उनका जो volume है, जो मैंने आपको बताया था, that is 80 to 90 or 85 to 90 जो है cubic microns, that will be less than 80 cubic microns, right? When it will be less than 80 cubic microns, it is called as microcytic. When it will be more than 90 cubic microns, it is called as macrocytic. राइट. अब इस आयरन डेफिशिएंसी एनीमिया को हम कैसे ट्रीट करते हैं? इट इज ट्रीटेड बाय इंक्रीजिंग आयरन इनटेक इन डाइट. डेफिनेटली जो इसका कॉज है, दैट इज जो मैंने यहाँ पे आपको बताया, व्हेन देयर इज डिक्रीज्ड इनटेक ऑफ आयरन कंटेनिंग फूड. एंड हमें जो है इस आयरन को हमारी बॉडी में बढ़ाने के लिए वी हैव टू टेक आयरन रिच फूड इन आवर बॉडी, और वी कैन ऑल्सो टेक आयरन सप्लीमेंट्स इन फॉर्म ऑफ टैबलेट्स. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, हम जो है आयरन सप्लीमेंट लेते हैं, जिसकी वजह से हम इस आयरन को हमारी बॉडी में इंक्रीज कर सकते हैं, सो दैट इनफ आयरन इज अवेलेबल फॉर द सिंथेसिस ऑफ हीमोग्लोबिन. Right? That is about the iron deficiency anemia. Now the third type is actually pernicious anemia. Now this pernicious anemia is actually deficiency of vitamin B12. Okay, because we have already talked about in the erythropoiesis, we have already talked about what are the things which are necessary for the process of erythropoiesis, right? And in that we have already talked about कि इनमें जो है आयरन के साथ साथ हमें विटामिन B12 and folic acid जो है, that is also very important for the process of erythropoiesis. Now, when there will be deficiency of vitamin B12, so what will happen is vitamin B12 एक्चुअली जो है, जब हम vitamin B12 हमारे जो है डाइट के साथ vitamin B12 जो है हमें मिलता है, and that vitamin B12 is there in the gastrointestinal tract. For example, it is vitamin B12. That vitamin B12 has to be absorbed into the circulation so that this vitamin B12 can be taken to bone marrow, where it will be utilized for the process of erythropoiesis. But for the absorption of vitamin B12, we need a protein there, and that protein is called as intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor. And this intrinsic factor is actually secreted by the parietal cells in the stomach. Parietal cells. And these parietal cells are secreting the intrinsic factor, and this intrinsic factor actually combines with vitamin B12, and it is this intrinsic factor which helps the vitamin B12 to get absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract into the circulation. Now, what happens in the pernicious anemia? It is actually autoimmune disorder. Autoimmune disorder, and autoimmune disorder is actually a disorder where our immune system, हमारा अपना ही इम्यून सिस्टम जो है एंटीबॉडीज प्रोड्यूस करता है, जिनको हम ऑटो एंटीबॉडीज कहते हैं. दीज एंटीबॉडीज क्या करते हैं? ये हमारे बॉडी के नॉर्मल टिश्यू को ही डैमेज कर देते हैं. Right? There are different autoimmune disorders, and this pernicious anemia is also an autoimmune disorder. और इसमें जो एंटीबॉडीज प्रोड्यूस होती है, इसमें जो एंटीबॉडीज फॉर्म होती है, वो एक्चुअली हमारे गैस्ट्रिक म्यूकोसा को जो है डैमेज कर देते हैं. मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंटली द पैराइटल सेल्स इन द गैस्ट्रिक म्यूकोसा. So, when these parietal cells will be destroyed, when these parietal cells will be damaged, what does that mean is these parietal cells will not be able to secrete this intrinsic factor. What will happen is there will be less intrinsic factor available for the absorption of vitamin B12. Right? And when there is decreased intrinsic factor available, that means decreased vitamin B12 will be absorbed into the circulation. And decreased amount of vitamin B12 is going to be available for the process of erythropoiesis. So it is technically, अगर हम देखें, it is not the deficiency of vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 हम डाइट के साथ लेते ही है. It is because of the deficiency of intrinsic factor. But actually जो है अब हम इसको कहते हैं it is deficiency of vitamin B12 because it is vitamin B12 which is needed there in the bone marrow for the process of erythropoiesis. But this vitamin B12 can reach the bone marrow only when there is intrinsic factor available or secreted there in the stomach. Right? And so intrinsic factor इसमें जो है secrete नहीं होता है, तो जिसकी वजह से हम vitamin B12 को absorb नहीं कर पाते. So, it is an autoimmune disorder which destroys the cells of gastric mucosa, which I have told you. And what happens without vitamin B12? Vitamin B12 जो है मैंने आपको कहा erythropoiesis, that is formation of mature red blood cells के लिए vitamin B12 is very important. अब इसके बगैर जो है vitamin B12 के बगैर जो developing RBCs होती है वो grow तो कर पाती है लेकिन वो divide नहीं कर पाती है. इस विटामिन B12 की वजह से, इस विटामिन B12 की डेफिशिएंसी की वजह से आई कैन से कि जो डेवलपिंग आरबीसीज होती है वो डिवाइड नहीं कर पाती है, और इसकी वजह से जो है हमारे इस ब्लड सर्कुलेशन में जो लार्जर सेल्स होती है, मतलब लार्जर सेल जो आरबीसीज का साइज होना चाहिए, लार्जर सेल्स जो है हमारे सर्कुलेशन में अपीयर होती है. और लार्जर, क्योंकि हमने देखा था जब सेल्स डिवाइड होती है तो उनका साइज जो है धीरे धीरे कम होता है, एंड अल्टीमेटली इट रीच अबाउट 7.5 माइक्रॉन्स जो उनका डायमीटर होता है रेड ब्लड सेल्स का, मैच्योर आरबीसीज का. और वो बिकॉज ऑफ दैट डिवीजन उनका साइज जो है धीरे धीरे कम होता है. बट व्हेन दे कैन नॉट डिवाइड, व्हाट हैपेंस इज कि वो जो लार्जर सेल्स है वही हमारे इस जो है सर्कुलेशन में अपीयर होती है. So when there are larger cells which are appearing in the circulation, so we call it as macrocytes, or it is also called as macrocytic anemia. Right. And this pernicious anemia, it can actually be treated by giving intramuscular injection और विटामिन B12 कंटेनिंग जो है जेल, जो हमारे नेजल म्यूकोसा में जो है जेल अप्लाई करते हैं, दैट कंटेन्स विटामिन B12. बट यूजुअली हम जो है इंट्रामस्कुलर इंजेक्शन ऑफ विटामिन B12 जो है लेते हैं फॉर ट्रीटिंग द पर्निशियस एनीमिया. पर्निशियस एनीमिया की तरह ही और एक जो है एनीमिया होता है, दैट इज कॉल्ड एज मेगालोब्लास्टिक एनीमिया. And that megaloblastic anemia is actually because of the deficiency of folic acid. Folic acid. और फॉलिक एसिड की वजह से भी जो है यही होता है, डेफिशिएंसी ऑफ फॉलिक एसिड की वजह से लार्जर सेल्स जो है जिनको हम मेगालोब्लास्ट्स कहते हैं वो अपीयर होती है सर्कुलेशन में. नॉर्मल रेड ब्लड सेल्स जो है वो नहीं आती है, तो इसीलिए हम उसको कहते हैं मेगालोब्लास्टिक एनीमिया. लेकिन होता यही है कि उनमें जो है जो मैचुरेशन होता है वो एक्चुअली नहीं होता है बिकॉज ऑफ दिस डेफिशिएंसी ऑफ द फॉलिक एसिड और बिकॉज ऑफ द डेफिशिएंसी ऑफ विटामिन B12. सो विटामिन B12 इज एक्चुअली जो है इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर ड्यूरिंग द डेवलपिंग RBCs के लिए. दैट विटामिन B12 जो है वो डिवीजन के लिए वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट होता है ड्यूरिंग ऑल दोज स्टेजेस ऑफ एरिथ्रोपोइसिस. तो अब जब विटामिन B12 नहीं होगा तो डिवीजन नहीं होगा, तो लार्जर सेल्स जो है वो अपीयर होती है सर्कुलेशन में. सो दैट इज ऑल अबाउट द पर्निशियस एनीमिया. नाउ द नेक्स्ट टाइप इज रीनल एनीमिया. नाउ रीनल एनीमिया हमें नाम से ही पता चल रहा है दैट इट इज समथिंग रिलेटेड टू किडनीज. अब किडनीज में आई हैव ऑलरेडी टोल्ड यू वन ऑफ द इंपॉर्टेंट, वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट फैक्टर फॉर द प्रोसेस ऑफ एरिथ्रोपोइसिस फॉर फॉर्मेशन ऑफ रेड ब्लड सेल्स इज एरिथ्रोपोइटिन. Erythropoietin. It is a protein which is actually secreted in the kidneys. But where in the kidneys? It is actually secreted in the peritubular capillaries of the जो है kidneys. और kidneys में, for example, this is the afferent arteriole, this is the efferent arteriole, and here is the glomerular capillaries. और glomerular capillaries में filtration वगैरह होता है, और फिर जो है ये blood जब glomerulus या glomerular capillaries को leave करता है through the efferent arteriole, उसके बाद जो है this blood goes to the peritubular capillaries. And when there is peritubular capillaries, when there is decreased oxygen level in our body, when there is hypoxia or hypoxemia, तो उस decreased oxygen जो है वो इन peritubular capillaries में जो endothelial cells है इनको stimulate करता है, और यही endothelial cells जो है इस erythropoietin को जो है secrete करते हैं. और ये एरिथ्रोपोइटिन हमारे बोन मैरो को स्टिमुलेट करता है ताकि बोन मैरो ज्यादा से ज्यादा रेड ब्लड सेल्स को जो है फॉर्म करे. राइट. अब जब हमारे पास जो है कोई फॉर एग्जांपल किडनी डिजीज होती है, फॉर एग्जांपल रीनल डिजीजेस, और रीनल डिजीज की वजह से क्या होगा, दिस किडनी विल नॉट बी एबल टू सिक्रीट दिस एरिथ्रोपोइटिन. Right. So that is why it is called as renal anemia. And renal anemia में kidneys are actually not able to secrete erythropoietin. अगर हम kidneys को जो है stimulate भी करें, but as the kidneys are damaged, that means everything is actually not functioning properly. So what does that mean is erythropoietin will not be secreted. अब erythropoietin will not be secreted, bone marrow will not be stimulated. Bone marrow will not be stimulated, that means there is going to be decreased production of RBCs, क्योंकि RBCs का production के लिए erythropoietin is very, very important there. So it is actually lack of erythropoietin. It is mostly with the renal diseases, with damaged or diseased kidneys, and it is also treated because it is deficiency of erythropoietin. So this type of anemia is actually, इसको हम treat करते हैं by treating the kidney फॉर एग्जाम्पल अगर हमारा रीनल डिजीज है तो रीनल डिजीज को हम ट्रीट करते हैं, लेकिन जब तक वो ठीक होता है तब तक हम एरिथ्रोपोइटिन को सिंथेटिक फॉर्म में भी जो है इस पेशेंट में दे देते हैं, right? So this renal anemia can be treated with synthetic erythropoietin, right? इसके बाद we have the last type of anemia in this category, that is aplastic anemia. अब हमें पता है कि जो हमारे ब्लड सेल्स है, be it red blood cells, white blood cells or platelets, they are actually formed in the bone marrow. I have already told you. In the bone marrow, we have pluripotent hemopoietic stem cell, and pluripotent hemopoietic stem cell say there is myeloid stem cell formed and there is lymphoid stem cell formed. And lymphoid stem cell जो है that will give rise to lymphocytes, and myeloid stem cell से बाकी सारी types of blood cells जो है, red blood cells है, white blood cells except lymphocytes and platelets, सारी cells जो है इस myeloid stem cell से form होती है. But what if हमारा bone marrow जो है, इस बोन मैरो में कोई प्रॉब्लम है जिसकी वजह से ये सारी प्रोसेस जो है नहीं हो रही है, और इस बोन मैरो में एक्चुअली ब्लड सेल्स फॉर्म ही नहीं होती है. बट रिमेंबर, इट इज एक्चुअली, ये एक मिसनॉमर है, इट इज कॉल्ड एज एनीमिया, एप्लास्टिक एनीमिया. बट इसमें सिर्फ एनीमिया नहीं होता है, इसमें एक्चुअली जो है ल्यूकोपीनिया भी होता है, इसमें थ्रोम्बोसाइटोपीनिया भी होता है. What do I mean by that? It is not only red blood cell production जो है वो डिक्रीज होता है, इसमें व्हाइट ब्लड सेल्स भी कम फॉर्म होती है, इसमें प्लेटलेट्स भी कम फॉर्म होती है, एंड दैट कंडीशन इज एक्चुअली कॉल्ड एज पैनसाइटोपीनिया. सो व्हाट डज दैट मीन इज जो है इस कंडीशन में, प्लास्टिक एनीमिया में, इस बोन मैरो से एक्चुअली हम रेड ब्लड सेल्स को फॉर्म करते हैं, हम व्हाइट ब्लड सेल्स को फॉर्म करते हैं, और हम प्लेटलेट्स को फॉर्म करते हैं, राइट? And when there is problem in the bone marrow, what happens is there is decreased production of RBCs, but there is also decreased production of white blood cells, and there is decreased production of platelets. And when there is decreased production of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, that is called as pancytopenia. When there is decreased production, or when there is decreased in all the types of blood cells. राइट. अब इसको जो है, इसके लिए मैंने आपको कहा इट इज बिकॉज ऑफ द बोन मैरो डिसऑर्डर, एंड दिस बोन मैरो डिसऑर्डर कैन बी बिकॉज ऑफ द रिपीटेड एक्सपोजर टू एक्सरेज और गामा रेज जो है रेडिएशंस, or it can be because of any bacterial toxin, presence of any bacterial toxin, or it can be because of the gold salts, etc., or it can be also because of the viral infections, right? It can be because of the viral infections. Now, मैंने आपको अभी कहा कि जिनमें एप्लास्टिक एनीमिया होता है, इनमें सिर्फ एनीमिया नहीं होता है, इनमें सिर्फ रेड ब्लड सेल काउंट जो है वो कम नहीं होता है. व्हाट हैपेंस इज, इनमें एक्चुअली लो ऑक्सीजन कैरिंग कैपेसिटी ही कम नहीं होती है, इनमें व्हाइट ब्लड सेल काउंट भी कम होता है. And if there is decreased white blood cells present in the body or formed in our body, that means there is high risk of infections, right? और इसके बाद जो है there is thrombocytopenia as well, that means decreased platelet count. अब decreased platelet count जो है उनमें bleeding disorders हो सकते हैं, that means जो है hemostasis वाला काम है platelets का वो नहीं होगा, so that will lead to bleeding disorders. और फॉर एग्जाम्पल परप्यूरा जो है एक डिसऑर्डर है जो इसकी वजह से जो है हो सकता है डिक्रीज्ड काउंट ऑफ प्लेटलेट्स, एंड दैट इज आल्सो बिकॉज seen in the patients with the aplastic anemia. And इसको जो है हम जो है ट्रीट करते हैं इस aplastic anemia को by blood transfusions for example, or we can also treat it with bone marrow transplant. So that is all about the anemia, the types of anemia, but the types of anemia which will come under the blood loss. Because of the blood loss, that is hemorrhagic anemia, and these 4 types we have talked about, rather 5 जो है इसमें हमने और एक जो है बताया था, that is megaloblastic anemia. ये सारे जो types of anemia है, they come under the decreased production of RBCs. अब नेक्स्ट लेक्चर में we will talk about the types of anemia which are actually hemolytic anemia, which will come under the types of anemia because of the increased destruction of RBCs. So I hope it was clear. See you in the next lecture. Allah Hafiz.